Welcome to the workshop on writing a literature review for postgraduate coursework students. We hope you'll find some useful tips and strategies here. Here's the outline of the workshop. As you can see, we'll be working through using sources, structure and style issues and making sure your voice is heard. There's a mixture of information and activities throughout, and you'll also be encouraged to think about your own literature review. Note, however, that we won't cover searching databases and using EndNote. The RMIT library runs workshops throughout the year on these topics. When we think about writing a literature review, it's usual to only think about the text work, but identity work is equally important. This makes sure that you drive the literature review and that you don't end up with a literature review that's drowning in the literature. This workshop begins with the text work and then moves to the identity work, beginning in the section on style issues and then in the whole of the section on creating your voice of authority. This is the second section in the workshop. Selecting the best sources of literature for your review is the basis of a good review. There's always a lot of talk about the literature, but actually, what is it? The literature can be any source of information that has relevance. The most commonly used literature is from refereed academic journal articles, and your lecturers will certainly expect these to be used widely. However, in some disciplines, other sources are valid. We should also think about the word review. What does that actually mean? Reviewing means many things, such as looking for themes in the literature. We also need to be able to critique and evaluate ideas in research, look for links between research and be able to summarise the research in an area. Although, as we said, you may be able to use sources other than academic journals, what we do use must have some sort of validity. For example, you wouldn't cite information from Wikipedia. So how do you decide whether you should use a piece of literature you've found? Accuracy. The information needs to be reliable. Check to see if it is from a refereed journal. Authority. Who wrote it? Does he or she have credibility? How can you tell? If there's no author, is there an organisation? Is that credible? Objectivity. Are you being positioned or persuaded? If the article is obviously trying to persuade you, be warned. For example, if you found an internet site about the benefits of aromatherapy in the treatment of diabetes, and at the end, or popping up through the article, is an ad for aromatherapy products, that should tell you that this is not an objective article. Currency. How old is old? Generally, more than 3 to 5 years is considered old in most disciplines, but really, the more recent the better. Sometimes it's okay to use older sources if there's a good reason. For example, if no one has researched a topic since 1960. However, you would need to mention this when you cite it. Coverage. Does the article cover a range of things superficially, or does it go deep into only one issue? Which is best? Somewhere in the middle, perhaps. You want enough issues to be discussed so you can compare some of them. So if you pick 5 articles that each go very deeply into one solitary issue, it might be difficult for you to be able to compare. There are 3 kinds of sources. Primary, which are from the original authors, represented by red, yellow and blue in the diagrams. Secondary, where another person writes the original author's publication. Orange, green and violet are combination colours. Tertiary. These shouldn't be used because often no one really knows who wrote them or what their credentials are. These are original sources and the most commonly cited sources. Your lit review should mainly use these. Although these can be used in your lit review, use them sparingly. The problem with secondary sources is that you are reading an interpretation of the primary source. This may not be a true interpretation, or it may be an interpretation used for the secondary author's purposes, and this may be different to how you want to use the primary author in your work. These are very useful, but don't cite them unless you have a clear reason for doing so. For instance, you might need a definition of a concept in psychology or engineering, which you might find in a relevant discipline-based dictionary. Wikipedia is considered to be a tertiary source, but given that anyone can put anything up on Wikipedia, don't cite it. However, Wikipedia is great for getting the gist of some difficult concept before you read more detailed information. All texts need structure, and the Lit Review is no exception. We need some guiding principles so we can decide what to write about first, what next, what sections should go together, etc. So what does a literature review generally include? It includes the main ideas, theories and concepts related to your topic, agreement and disagreement related to your topic. It will include limitations or problems with research related to your topic. Your literature review is part of a thesis. It will also include the gap in scholarly knowledge that your research will fill. This is where the Lit Review generally sits within a thesis, but note that you may be required to structure your thesis a little different to this. Note that it answers the question, what do we already know, in relation to your research topic or question. See where the Lit Review sits within the thesis. Notice also that the Lit Review chapter has been ordered around themes, which form headings and subheadings. So we can talk about it as a discrete literature review, but the literature is also reviewed throughout the thesis. For instance, although the entire Lit Review provides a warrant for your study, you also need to bring in a little of the key literature to justify your rationale for the research in the introduction. You also need to justify your chosen research methodology using the literature, either through citing the benefits of this methodology in key methodology texts, or by giving an example of similar research that successfully used your chosen methodology, or doing both. When you discuss your results, it's also useful to bring back some of the key literature discussed in your Lit Review section in order to compare their findings with yours. And in a similar way, some of this literature can strengthen the claims you're making for your own research in your thesis conclusion. The Lit Review assignment has a similar structure to an essay. Like the Lit Review of a minor thesis, it also develops themes and highlights gaps in the literature. This fourth section of the workshop on writing a literature review deals with issues of style. We've already discussed choosing the literature and structuring your Lit Review. This section is about how to actually write it, beginning with developing themes and then looking at how to integrate your sources into your writing. Remember to always try to link the content and the activities to your own literature review. It's important to understand what a literature review does. And this is the same for both the Lit Review that's part of a thesis and for the standalone literature review assignment. The Lit Review should build a story around the topic. It's not good enough to passively report what the literature says. You have to make something of it. Here's an outline example of a section of Lit Review. What do you think about it? Is it effective? What's wrong with it? Writing one paragraph on text A, the next on text B, the next on text C, etc. is a common mistake we often see. A Lit Review is not an annotated bibliography. In other words, we don't just talk about what this person said, what the next person said, etc. What we have to do is identify and develop themes in the literature. Themes will become the building blocks of your Lit Review, so they're important. However, two big problems we often have are, firstly, identifying the themes, and secondly, keeping all the literature in our head while we're trying to identify new themes or deciding how articles fit into known themes. In this process, we began by selecting the literature and reading through the first article. The themes were then identified, and the author and main points were added to the table. This process was then repeated using other articles. Themes were broken down into sub-themes when necessary, and sometimes these need to be captured in a new table for that theme. To recap, here's the 5-step process for identifying and capturing themes. Of course, when you write your lit review, you need to use general academic writing skills, such as having a clearly identified topic sentence in each paragraph and making sure paragraphs link to each other. However, another set of skills are equally important: analysis, synthesis, critique, as well as paraphrasing and quoting. When you find several articles that say the same thing, this adds weight to what you want to say. Note the strength of the writer's voice in the first example, where similar information is grouped together. In this example, the text compares research findings, showing the relationship between authors by using the language of debate. Final example, the writer's voice is strong, as it is in the first example. However, unlike the close paraphrase of the first text, this gives a summary of the position in a research area. In the first example, the writer's voice stands out, with the author's name put at the end of the sentence. This is an information prominent citation. Generally try to use these information prominent citations because they enable your own voice to stand out. In the second example, the author's voices stand out because they are used as the subject of the information. These are called author prominent citations. Use these when you're constructing debate around contrasting ideas of two or more researchers. Note, however, that in some disciplines, author prominent citations are almost never used, and in others it's discouraged. If you haven't been given guidelines, look to see how articles in refereed academic journals in your discipline are cited and follow that. The last example has no citation. This is considered common discipline knowledge, so doesn't need a citation. But how do you know what is common knowledge and what's not? Check in your refereed journals. Is the information cited in these? If not, it's probably okay not to cite. However, anytime you're in doubt, cite the source. You won't get marks deducted for citing when you don't need to, but you might if you don't cite and should have. In the fifth section of the module on writing a literature review, we discuss the need for you to create your authoritative voice. Remember in the first module we said there were two parts to writing your lit review, the text work and the identity work. This section is about the identity work, that is, your identity as a scholar. Candler and Thompson use this metaphor of a dinner party to illustrate authority in the lit review. You're the host. The dinner is in your home. Your guests are coming and you're familiar with their thinking on a range of issues. You're quite close to some of them, but a few guests are new acquaintances and you want to know more about them. You've planned the menu and cooked the food. You're looking forward to initiating lively discussion around the dinner table. It's your night. To develop our own stance or position towards the literature means we need to adopt a healthy degree of appreciation and criticality. A way to think about this is to adopt a hands-on hips position, but we don't want to go too far the other way or we'll seem to be arrogant. It's a balance between making your voice heard but still showing courtesy even to those with whom you don't agree. The stake is to discuss each piece of literature one at a time, much the same as an annotated bibliography. Making your ideas central is essential. The way to do this is to look for areas of contention so you can discuss who agrees with whom and who doesn't. This allows you to critique effectively and develop your own stance. Remember that everything you write has a storyline, and the lit review is no exception. By identifying the story of the relevant research and how it relates to your topic, you'll be more likely to show your voice. You need to show appreciation and criticality in a professional manner. Here's another paragraph showing the writer's voice in red through critiquing the literature. Note the words attempt and attempted to. These words are not neutral. There's an assumption that it wasn't successful. Once again, the writer's voice is shown strongly in the second part of the topic sentence, the first sentence. There is no topic sentence. Every sentence has the researcher at the beginning and a fairly neutral verb. For example, Mortimer also contributes. Hopkins suggests. Reynolds and Cuttins also point out. Hargreaves and Hopkins also endorse. A summary of ideas with no evaluative stance. Your choice of reporting verb can demonstrate analysis and critical thinking and reading. Verbs such as states, argues, and shows are often overused. There are many more effective reporting verbs you can use. It really is easy to get bogged down on the literature and therefore in danger of our writing being drowned by the literature or having too much he said, she said in it. One way many writers find useful in preventing this is to use a story plot. This is like thinking and writing. It doesn't end up in your lit review, but from it you can develop a plan which will have your voice prominent. If you don't want to write this down, try recording it and playing it back.